Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second virtual meeting of the Overview and Scrutiny Commission. For the benefit of anyone watching on YouTube, I'm Councillor Peter Southgate and I chair the Commission. Let me introduce colleagues. Alongside me on the top row here, we have Councillor Nick McLean. Second row, from the left, Councillor Paul Kohler, Councillor Ed Gretton, Councillor Owen Pritchard, and then our Director of Children's Services, Rachel Wardell. And I'm looking for the councillors here. We have on the next row, is that Katie there? Okay. Followed by Tom Walsh of Sustainable Merton. Then Councillor Sally Kenny, Councillor Joan Henry, and on the bottom row here we have Councillor Eleanor Stringer, our Cabinet Member for Children's Services, and Councillor Natasha Irons, Councillor John Dehaney, and Mansour Ahmed, our co-opted member. So I think I've introduced everyone. During the meeting, just the elected members will appear on screen and our speakers will come in as and when it's appropriate. We're going to run this, Rosie, on an open mic basis so we can move more smoothly.
That's right. So everyone's responsible for their own microphones today. So hopefully that will make it run a little bit more smoothly. So when the chair invites you to speak, please just unmute your microphone.
You in order. Can I deal also with, at this stage, disclosures of pecuniary interest? Does anyone have any such interest to declare? I take that as no.
None, Chair.
And apologies for absence we have from Colin Powell and Emma Lemon.
Lemon, yes.
Yes. Otherwise, we expect Councillor Peter McCabe to join us late, as he often the way. Can I take the minutes of our last meeting? If you're content to accept these as an accurate record, we'll just take that as given. If you dissent from that, perhaps you could raise your hand and tell me where you are unhappy with the minutes. So no dissent. And do we have any matters arising that people want to raise? We don't. Okay, good. Our first major item tonight is on the response of our Children's Services Department to the COVID-19 pandemic. And we will also be getting an up-to-date picture on the return to school, which I know is of interest to many of us. And I'm going to ask Councillor Eleanor Stringer as a Cabinet Member.
You were breaking up a bit there, Councillor McCabe. Is it my turn to speak? Shall I take that as a yes? Thank you very much for having me to Overview and Scrutiny. I'm Councillor Eleanor Stringer. I'm the Cabinet Member for Children's Services and Education. And I do very much apologise if I am speaking over Peter Southgate, but I can't hear him. So you read the report and I'll outline some highlights, and Rachel Wardell, our Director of Children's Services, is here to talk more about the work that we've been doing and that others in the community have been doing. I'd first like to mention something not in my portfolio, but which is worth highlighting, which is we already knew that we had a housing crisis in our borough. And this crisis has brought that to the forefront of our minds because we've seen the impact that overcrowding has on families' ability to stay healthy, stay happy, to educate their children, and so on during the lockdown. So I mention this because whilst not something I'm responsible for, it's had such a huge impact on the children and families that I am here to represent. Moving on to our report, our response. So the report outlines the careful planning that the children's schools and families, staff, schools, and other partners and delivery bodies have put into planning, adapting, and implementing new ways of working, all with the aim of protecting services for our children and young people. I'd like to place on record my thanks to everybody who's been involved in this, both on the front line and also behind the scenes with the planning and delivery. Luckily, our staff teams in Merton have not been affected by absence due to sickness that we had initially planned for. And this is good because, as you will see from the report, we have seen increases in the number of vulnerable children. Our core social services team have continued their frontline work for these children and families, but sometimes in different ways. Our youth services have adapted to provide remote and outdoor support. Moving on to schools, they've been open to these vulnerable children throughout, and the numbers attending have been rising. And there's been a lot of behind the scenes work to ensure that those children who we thought would most likely to benefit from being at school rather than being left at home were attending the education provision. I'm really proud of the way that we've worked with head teachers, and in turn how head teachers have worked with their staff and parents to confidently but cautiously open their doors to more pupils. We've now have over 4,500 children attending schools this week, and that number has been increasing week by week. And the efforts that schools have put into making this safe actually means that, if we're honest, schools are often living up to much higher standards than others are in the rest of the community. Meanwhile, schools are continuing to offer home learning opportunities to those not in school. In a world where, as I've already said, children's home lives, their access to space, to devices, their parental ability to support learning are not equal, so this has been a challenge. And there have been a number of challenges in all of this. Often, though not always, linked to actions by the Department for Education. For example, their decision to establish a voucher scheme for those eligible for free school meals that was led by a private company, which was chaotic for many schools and for some of our poorest families. But overall, these challenges have been addressed as well as we could have done so far. What I'm really worried about now is what happens next. As the report says, the numbers eligible for free school meals due to low incomes have risen. We know that child poverty is associated with poorer life outcomes due to the strain that poverty places on these families. Schools will be open, hopefully, in the autumn, but children will have had very different experiences since they've been closed in March. As more children are out in the community and they've been seen, we expect more referrals to safeguarding from people worried about what children have experienced whilst trapped at home. And meanwhile, we have to continue to deliver on savings plans and service improvements, restructures, and all the other business as usual stuff that we've already got planned and that schools also will have planned. So while I'm immensely proud of the work so far, we are not out of the woods. We will need everybody's support and challenge to ensure that children and young people's well-being and outcomes are protected and improved. But I'm confident that our teams, our partners, and our families and children have extraordinary resilience, and that resilience is very much going to be needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellie. Yes, and thank you for that helpful summary there, actually, and bring us up to date on a number of things, particularly the number attending school this week. Can I invite questions for Ellie and indeed for Rachel? Paul. Paul, we're not hearing you at the moment.
No. Thank you for the report, Eleanor, and thank you to Rachel and the teams for all they're doing. It's a very difficult time. Just so I make sure I understand the report, looking at paragraphs 2.11 onwards, am I right that the number of vulnerable children we have in the borough is about 2,500? Is that what 2.12, 12, 13, 14, 15, all those are classed as vulnerable children, is that correct?
Those are classed as vulnerable under the government's current definition under COVID. So those were the children who had an entitlement to a school place as a result. It wouldn't usually be our definition of those children, but that's how they're described in the current guidance.
Okay, and under 2.17, at the height, just 10% of those are coming into school. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
That 90%, what do we know about that 90%?
Well, we're in contact with them all. So we know different things about them because they've got different things going on in their lives. All of them have been entitled to a school place, and we have been in discussion with their families about whether it would be appropriate to take that school place up. You'll notice that by far the largest number of children that are categorised in this way is children with an education, health and care plan. So there's some 2,000 of those, and a very significant number of those have stayed at home, largely because that's been their family preference during this period. And of course, many of those children will have additional health needs, which may influence that decision, or maybe part of families with additional health needs, which influences that decision. There's a small handful of children for whom access to a school place has been sought, but it's been difficult to deliver because their complex needs have meant that the schools themselves have not been able to accommodate them given their staffing arrangements. And that's when they are in special schools rather than in mainstream. Where that's so, we've maintained our educational contacts, social work and health contacts directly with families. Where we're talking about children with a social worker, all of those children have a plan with us. They have regular visits where the risk is high. Those visits are undertaken in person. Where the risk is lower or minimal, those are usually undertaken virtually. And over time, more and more of those children have returned to school. But by far the largest proportion of children with a social worker in school is those children about whom we would have real concern if they had been at home throughout this period. So we've been assuring ourselves that those children for whom being in school really is the right option are there.
I think we lost you temporarily, Chair.
Peter, we lost you for a few moments then.
Sorry, yes. Beyond my control. Yes, I've had John Dehaney. You had indicated for a question, John?
Yes, I have a question here on page 7, paragraph 2.2. You said any of the children were without adequate resources to support their home-based learning. What's going to happen to those kids when they go back to school?
So all our schools are aware that there's been a significant variation in home environment for learning. And so as children are returning to school in greater numbers, the first thing that the school is doing is to check those children's well-being and work with them to assess how much they've missed as a result. So for children for whom it's been really difficult to maintain their learning, and that's sometimes because there might be one computer shared between a number of children of the family and indeed the adults of the family, or it might be because the space in which they're undertaking their learning is shared space, and so there are other children and adults occupying that space and making it difficult to learn. All of those things compromise home learning. So schools are assessing as children return what the gaps are and working with those children to try and remedy those gaps. But their first priority really is to ensure that children resettle and feel safe, and that any other emotional well-being aspects in their lives are sorted out in order for them to feel safe and ready to learn. So that's the initial priority at this stage. And once schools have evaluated what the gaps are for children, they'll take steps to remedy those gaps.
Thank you, Rachel.
Yes, I was just wondering that if those kids have a lot of catching up to do, how is the teacher going to cope with those who need catching up and those who are right up to date and they're both in the same class?
So teachers are very practiced actually at the skill of differentiated learning. So it's quite usual for there to be a gap in
I
understanding.
have a frozen screen. I don't know about everyone else.
We're all good.
We're all good, Peter.
I'll carry on answering the question if
If you
that's
turn
all
your
right.
video off, Chair, just temporarily and turn it back on again, maybe that will fix it.
So yes, it's quite usual for teachers to have to differentiate learning. So children in the same class will often have differences in ability, differences in prior attainment, and differences in understanding in the current
Am I back
subject.
here?
So what we're likely to find is that the differentiation will be wider and it may be more complex, and schools may need additional support to manage that. But we'll only be able to identify that fully once all children are back, and we're in constant contact with
I've lost communication with the meeting here.
Can we nominate one of the other chairs from one of the other scrutiny committees to stand in as deputy chair to try and handle this?
Let me bring in Julia for a second. Hang on.
I think that would be a good idea. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I think that would be a good idea while Councillor Southgate sorts out his camera. Hopefully he will be back very soon.
I have tried moving him to on hold, and I have tried stopping his video and restarting it. I think it might be an internet issue.
Julia,
Right.
Rosie, can we re-establish a connection?
Yeah, we can hear you. We just can't see you.
But it might be better if he turns off his camera if his bandwidth is too small. So if he doesn't have his camera and it's just audio, it might be easier.
Yeah, that might work. Do you want to turn your camera off for a bit, Councillor Southgate, and then maybe turn it on again in about 5 minutes and see if that's better?
Julia, can I move that the committee has Natasha as temporary chair of this meeting to get to the end of this meeting? I propose that motion.
I'll second it.
Okay, is everyone in favour? Anyone dissent? Everyone's in favour.
Yes,
Okay.
Could someone just please message Peter to tell him?
I'll try and give him a call, Julia.
Yeah, if you can phone him on his landline. Thanks, Rosie.
Congratulations.
Yes, well, thank this. Volunteers up. Okay, where were we? Sorry. So I did see Councillor Gretton, and then I'll go to Councillor Henry.
Thank you very much, Councillor Rhymes. I just wanted to note that schools came back even from the 1st of June, and I think all of us were probably watching that level of infection in the borough just to make sure that it didn't suddenly spike at all. And actually what we saw was the opposite. I think the numbers dropped in the last couple of weeks and in the last 7 days as well, just down to I think it's 2 new cases, which is very reassuring and positive. I should just note that 2 new cases out of a population of, I think Merthyr's got 206,000 people, which is positive. Just in terms of helping to get those schools open, because it seems to be there's been quite a bit of variance between the different schools in different parts of the borough as well as to getting classes and school years back. So I wanted just to ask the cabinet member what the council's been able to do to help and support those schools who haven't been able to get as many classes back and as many years back, and in particular where space may be an issue in those schools. What's the council been able to do to actually help guide and support those schools? Thank you.
I'll answer, and then Rachel may want to chip in as well. But thank you, Councillor Gretton, and good question. And one that I've been constantly asking is, we appreciate this variation because that's what we wanted. We wanted to work with what schools could do, particularly in those early weeks of everyone cautiously reopening. And now, as you say, looks like it's getting safer. Encourage wider reopening and support that where it's safe. Yeah, because you're right, a lot of the variation comes down to simple things, not always just spacing. Sometimes it might be that they've already got a lot of key worker and vulnerable children attending, for example, and sometimes they might have staffing issues as well. But spacing is definitely one, and again, not just always in the immediate school, but kind of in the kind of access to it. My understanding is that the Department for Education has been pretty clear that we shouldn't be using buildings beyond the school as educational settings at the moment. So we're somewhat limited in that for this summer term. What schools are looking at are things like, okay, maybe for the last week or the last 2 weeks, can they invite other children in and swap some children out so that at least everybody's getting kind of some educational experience. And you'll see there'll be further openings and adjustments making to individual schools over the next few weeks. Rachel, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, so I mean, we're in touch with our schools daily, providing information and updates, and a couple of times a week they get a call from one of our education partners. And so where we can, we've been supporting them to think imaginatively about the space that they have available. The government's been really clear that the wider reopening cannot depend on additional finances, additional staffing, or new classrooms. So there's a limit to what can be provided in terms of additionality, and they've been equally clear that we can't take over community space that has otherwise been required to be closed at this time. The one potential room for manoeuvre is on secondary school sites, where they've made it clear that it would be theoretically possible for children to be accommodated on secondary school sites, but there are some significant issues around deploying that with variable numbers of children in sites that they don't know well, and moving staff to alternate sites for provision. And what we don't have currently is a widespread mismatch between parental demand for return and school availability. So we're actually seeing lower uptake from parents than schools have space for. What I anticipate is that the change to the guidance from yesterday in relation to social distancing measures may change how schools are using their spaces, and that may further increase the number of young people who return. And particularly there's great encouragement there for children outside the priority groups to return where it's safe for them to do so. And the government has signalled very clearly its intention that all children in all year groups should be back in all schools from September onwards. So we are working with our schools to manage that as well.
Okay, and just to pick up on the previous point about helping those pupils and students who might have fallen behind, does a cabinet member have a feel for what proportion of pupils and students might have fallen behind, and in particular, what's the council doing to help and support the schools and plan for the use of the government's new fund? I think it was this £1 billion catch-up tutoring fund that's been announced. I think the £650 million is for primary schools and secondary schools, and £350 million specifically for the more disadvantaged children. So what's the council doing to actually help schools plan to actually make use of those funds and give students who have fallen behind better access or new access to tutoring?
I'm not going to give you a number for how many children have fallen behind and in what way, because the huge thing is that there'll be huge variation even within that, because people have fallen behind in different levels. And even some of the children that we may think of as middle class and going off and doing learning will have been learning lots of different things in different ways. So it won't be that they'll all turn up at school at the same level. In answering your second question, I have to declare an interest in that I'm working for the Education Endowment Foundation, who is working in my day job, who's working with the Department for Education on the delivery of that £350 million additional national tutoring programme. The £650 million, which is proposal, is it's going directly to schools. We don't know the exact makeup of that yet, so we don't know how much Merton schools are getting. We are already used to supporting schools to think about how to use their pupil premium effectively, which is the money they get around disadvantaged pupils. And we are already used to supporting teaching and learning through the school clusters, through the Merton Schools Partnership Attain project. And then what we have done specifically during this crisis is also set up working groups around remote learning, because our hypothesis is that there still may be an element of remote learning for some time, at least the kind of some groups of pupils coming in and out. And so we want to ensure there is best practice there. But it's as soon as we know what schools we're getting and what they can use it on, we will be thinking about how to support their most effective use of that.
Peter, do you want me to hand back over to you?
Well, Natasha, I suggest you continue to the end of this item because you will know
Okay.
who
So-
taken questions and who hasn't.
Cool. So Councillor Henry next, and then Councillor Kenny.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, everyone. Just quick question between Councillor Stringer and the Director. What step has been taken to protect the youth centre and the community centre after the lockdown, please? And financially. Did you get that?
Yeah, I'll give an answer, and then it'd be good to get Rachel in, because I'm exploring exactly this. So as far as I know, youth services haven't been given the kind of go ahead precisely to open over the summer, but it looks like that might come, and I'd be keen that we are offering some services over the summer, but they have had to close down. They've had to close down their face-to-face services. I don't have an answer for how we can support them financially, because we don't have any more money and we're already spending lots more money on other things. But my understanding is that within our existing budget, if we were told that we could get going with our youth services again, we've got the plans in place to do that and the budget in place to do that. Rachel, I don't know if you want to add.
Yeah, well, yes, only to add that although the centres obviously have not been able to be open, the youth work hasn't stopped. So we've redesigned our youth work around the detached youth work model. We've had youth workers out in the borough, in particular during the more extreme periods of the lockdown, working with young people to make sure that they returned home, that they were socially distancing appropriately if they were out, that they weren't breaking any of the lockdown rules. The feedback that we had from them was that by and large, our young people were better behaved than some of the adults in terms of compliance. So as the lockdown restrictions gradually got lifted, of course, we did see more young people congregating, but the detached youth work continued to support the kind of enforcement measures through the kind of engagement and education elements of that without the need for enforcement. We've also maintained relationships with the young people who we would ordinarily work with through the youth centres through things a bit like this. So there have been Zoom meetings of the Youth Parliament. There have been Zoom meetings of different groups who have wanted to get together and to discuss some of the biggest issues of the day, including, for example, Black Lives Matter, and that's been an important thing that our young people have wanted to speak about and to have youth work support. So throughout this period, we have been continuing to find innovative ways to make sure that our youth service can support our young people. But it's really clear that they want to get together again, that they want to be able to engage in group work in the centres. The guidance that emerged yesterday suggests that community centres can be reopened. Youth centres weren't explicitly mentioned there, but my assumption would be that that's a very similar kind of building and that we'll be able to return to some of the work that we've been doing. Over the period, we have heard concerns expressed that some of the external funders that fund some of our youth work, because of course it's not by any means all funded by us, that some of those external funders may be reconsidering their funding position, and that we're treating in the same way we would any concern about loss of income. So we would continue to speak to funders, encourage them to see how important this work is and to continue to engage with us to find ways to make their funding work well in the borough. But I would like to reassure you that youth work is alive and well in Merton.
I have one more question, if you don't mind, because I wanted you to answer that one first.
Okay. Make it brief, please.
Yeah, okay. My next question is, what steps have been taken so far to ensure that young people who are homeless and now in temporary accommodation will be supported with a permanent accommodation after the lockdown?
I regret to say, Councillor Henry, that I can't answer that question because the homelessness issue is actually undertaken outside of the Children's Schools and Families Department. So where a young person becomes looked after, that's clearly our responsibility. But when they're housed by our housing colleagues. But I can undertake to take that question away and check what numbers of young people we have in temporary accommodation under these arrangements and what the permanent arrangements are. But the housing services is currently working to determine how all of those temporarily accommodated people's needs will be met permanently after this is over. So I will discuss that with my colleagues and get you a written answer.
Thank you. So Councillor Kenny and then Councillor McLean, please. Sally, you're muted.
Thank you. Can I first of all say a huge thank you to Rachel, our director, and Ellie, our cabinet member, for all the amazing work you're doing. It's been exemplary during this very, very difficult time. And I very much appreciate, Rachel, the updates you're sending out to the CYP. It's really appreciated. So we do not know what's going on. So thank you. And in this difficult time, remember it, what you do, both of you, is appreciated. 2 questions. The first one is probably to Rachel. How many staff are there who are unable to attend school and teach due to their partner, child, children being vulnerable and not being able to mix with the community, who perhaps have very serious illnesses? Do you keep a rota on that? Because I know it does happen. And another thing, Ellie, you came on about no other buildings other than schools are going to be used at the moment. But I've had parents say to me, their schools have told them that in September, they're going to start using church halls and similar. Is this going to be the case? Thank you.
Councillor Kenny, we do have some records about staff absences where schools are using iTrent to record that data, so that the council's staff absence record is held on a system called iTrent, and schools, many of our schools do use that, and where they do use that, I am able to extract a report. So the numbers that I'm aware of are that we have had hovering around 300 staff who are either self-isolating or shielding during this period. So they have been at home. The vast majority of those have been at home but working, because obviously the delivery of learning has been undertaken remotely at this time. I get twice a day reports of that, and the numbers are just starting to go down at the moment. So they've dropped under 300 for the first time in probably about 6 or 7 days ago. But they've kind of settled for quite a long time. Again, we're seeing changes to the expectations around shielding for any member of the community, and I would anticipate that will change those numbers somewhat. So that's not a complete picture, but that gives you a bit of an indication. Throughout the entire period, we've never had more than about a dozen staff who have been off with suspected or confirmed coronavirus. So the numbers of actual cases is very low, but self-isolation and shielding is considerably higher.
And on your second question about the use of community centres, I don't really have much to add, because it'd be interesting to know if those are Merton schools that you're talking about. Okay, we'll be interested to follow up with those, because I wasn't aware of that being the plan for any at the moment. They might have been talking speculatively about what could happen next year if there are expectations, but we're talking about for this term. So, you know, the government rode back on this expectation that all primary school pupils will get back, and there were some people saying, well, can we use all these other centres to make that happen? And the government was pretty clear that for this term, that's not the expectation. Thank you.
So Councillor McLean, and then if there's no other questions, I might ask one and then we can wrap things up.
Okay, thank you, Chair. If I can also begin by adding my thanks to Rachel, her team, and Councillor Stringer for all the work that you've undertaken in a very, very difficult period. I'd actually just like quickly go back to the online schooling. I appreciate the practical difficulties that you outlined earlier. But I was just wondering, do we know what percentage of our schools are able to get and operate platforms such as Google Classroom, Zoom, Microsoft Teams, etc.? And will the council ask, do we need to provide any assistance to ensure that happened timely and with as much as possible?
So I can't give you a percentage of schools that have been able to operate various different platforms. Our priority has been to make sure that learning resources are supplied to children, rather than measuring how much of that delivery is online and through what arrangements. What I can tell you is that the secondary schools were much more online ready than primary schools, unsurprisingly, I would guess. And so there's been much greater usage and take up at the secondary phase. Part of the reason why we haven't devoted resources and energy to trying to establish what the schools, what percentage of schools can deliver what through different online platforms is because whatever the schools can deliver is not necessarily matched by what children and families can receive at their end. And we certainly don't have reach into individual families to discover who is able to access what online platforms for how long each day, and how much of that access, for example, is shared or compromised by poor technology. So I can't answer the question about percentages, but I can say broadly much greater and more effective uptake in secondary, where there is in some of our schools there is online lesson delivery, much less so in primary, but there have been some really exemplary situations where people have been taking paper resources to families that have no access to online learning, and all sorts of different ways of ensuring that children stay connected with their school and receive work.
If I can quickly chip in one thing. Firstly on that, yeah, I think we should be careful about when we're talking about remote learning, not assuming that's online learning, because it's really about the pedagogy and the content and the kind of nature of the task and the feedback, which all the evidence suggests is way more important than whether it happens to be online or a printed worksheet. But I'd be surprised. I think most of our schools, from my understanding, will be using some kind of platform to send things out by now. But that doesn't, as Rachel said, mean that it's being engaged well with at home. We know there's huge variation there. And the other quick shout out I want to do is to the Don's Local Action Group, who set up the Keep Kids Connected campaign. If you're not aware of it, you can go and give them money so they can buy laptops. They have an Amazon wish list where I bought a couple of tablets, or you can give old laptops, and they've been reconditioning those safely and then giving those out to schools across Burton and neighbouring boroughs so that they can support most vulnerable children.
Okay, so Councillor Southgate wanted to say, no, sorry, Councillor Gretton, Councillor Southgate, and then I'm going to have a question. I think we might need to wrap things up a bit, otherwise we'll go round and round.
Yes, thank you, Chair. My question is about the state of foster care in Merton. We read a report yesterday that demand for foster places is up by some 44%. And I have to note too, in my Merton, an appeal for foster care.
Peter,
I've lost Councillor Southgate again.
Yeah, Peter, you're frozen. Just go on audio and not on visual, and see if that works. You there?
Or is it worth Rachel giving a quick update? It sounded like this question was mainly about the state of foster care and our demand for foster carers.
Yeah, so I think Councillor Southgate mentioned a campaign in my Merton. So we are always looking for new foster carers. It is our ambition to have as many of our looked after children cared for in a family environment and as close to Merton as possible. And so we are always looking to expand our pool of foster carers, and we have used this time where people might have a bit more time to think, a bit more time to connect with their community, might be more motivated to be volunteering, might be more community minded. We've used this time to increase our visibility of our campaign for foster carers, and we have made a point of seeking foster carers at this time, but our own local need hasn't increased very much. So you'll see in your report at paragraph 2.15, number of children looked after has gone up from 150 during this period to 157, and we haven't had difficulty making placements at this time. So we're not under pressure to find additional foster carers for our children, but we would always seek to increase that pool.
Sorry, Councillor Gretton, Mansell's actually put his hand up. I'm seeing as Peter's dropped off. I'll let you come in because Peter's dropped off. So I'll let Mansell go first, and then you.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks for the report, which is really appreciated. I've got a question. What measures have been established to replace meals received from school?
The early days of the lockdown, there wasn't a national scheme to replace free school meals. So schools were doing different things. So some schools were providing vouchers, some schools were providing flat cash payments, some schools were providing meals themselves, either for collection or on delivery. Partway through the lockdown, a national scheme, which is the Edenred scheme, was promoted by central government. And what that allowed schools to do was to register families who were eligible for free school meals with that voucher provider, and the vouchers could then be downloaded, sent to families or printed by the school, and used in a selection of supermarkets. There were, in the early days of that scheme, real difficulties for families in accessing that, both everything from simply schools trying to get online to make their applications, through to getting the downloadable vouchers and getting them sent to families, and even sadly in some cases families trying to use them in supermarkets and having them refused at the checkout, which I think is a terrible situation for anyone to find themselves in. But as time has gone on, and everyone has become more familiar with the platform, and it has improved its performance, and people understand how it's used, those arrangements seem to be operating more smoothly. We have heard recently that the government is allowing funding for free school meals to continue over the weeks that would usually be the summer holiday, where free school meals wouldn't ordinarily be provided. But the Edenred scheme is ending at the end of July, and schools will need to apply for the 6 weeks worth of vouchers for those families before the scheme closes at the end of July, and print and distribute or download and send to families all of those vouchers ahead of the summer holiday.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sorry, did you want a follow-up question?
Oh, thanks. Yeah, thanks.
Councillor Gretton then?
Yeah, just a really quick one for the cabinet member. Obviously, with this extra funding that's been made available by the government for each of the schools in our borough, I think it's for things like the free school meals vouchers, but also for measures such as additional cleaning and keeping schools open extra time in vacations and so on. Are all the schools actually accessing that money now? It's coming through. I guess there's probably several £1 million coming through into the Merton schools, and will the cabinet member be able to confirm that every school is going to access 100% of that funding now that it's available to them?
I have to confess, I don't know what funding you're talking about. So if we're talking about the £1 billion that we were saying earlier, then that isn't coming through till, as I understand it, September. And that is very much around teaching and learning, and not about any
no, this is the exceptional cost funding. Yeah, the exceptional cost funding.
Oh, right. So okay, so then that's similar to what we can access for. Okay, that's similar to what local authority can access. Then but my understanding is that how that's being run is schools are doing what they need to do, and then they've got to kind of claim it back from the government. So I don't know if that's started to happen yet. Sorry, Rachel, do you know the details on that?
My understanding is that schools will be applying for every penny that they possibly can, because they have extended themselves considerably over this period without a guarantee of return. We will obviously be supporting them to do that, and we will be hoping that all of the outlay that schools have put in place is covered. The government has made this provision available, but it's not clear that everything that schools have spent will necessarily be covered. So we'll be pushing very hard for that to be so, and obviously we'll appreciate Councillor Gretton's support in making sure that that's so.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, I just wanted to ask a quick question, and I think maybe we can move on to the next section and Peter can go back to driving this. So on the school meals, so again, how will schools be reimbursed for what they outlaid? But also, if there is a second wave, are we confident that this system is now ironed out all the kinks, and that we won't get back to a situation where children kind of go without food in a terrible way? And then secondly, there's a point in the report about this disproportionately affecting BAME children because of the disproportionate effects of COVID. And I'm just wondering kind of what partnerships and what kind of working is going on with the CCG to try and mitigate that, also with things like well-being and mental health and the kind of fallout that this will have on a longer term basis.
Yeah, so I am more confident than I would have been a couple of months ago that we could manage free school meals in a second lockdown, because I do think a lot of the teething problems of the systems that were invented on the hoof in the early days of this crisis have now settled down. So I don't think I could say that I'm 100% confident, because we do continue to find glitches in systems, and it can, you know, and there remain challenges, but I am much more confident of that. What I am 100% confident of is that we have good food security mechanisms in the borough. So although the free school meals arrangements may not necessarily work, we might, where that is so, we will find that we are supporting through the community fridge, through all of the kind of food hardship arrangements that have been established and put in place, and those have been called upon a lot during this crisis, but they have worked very effectively, and have a high level of confidence that if there are problems with the voucher system, then those community resources can and will step up. So that's in relation to the food vouchers. And your other question, Councillor Irons, was what?
So talking about the kind of disproportionate impact on
yes.
babies, but then also just kind of health and well-being in general as we go forward for these children.
Yes, so there's a particular piece of work which is being done within the council. It's being co-sponsored by the public health team, and also by John Dimmer's team, and I'm working alongside them on that, which is to look at the disproportionate impacts of COVID on the community, including for reasons of race and ethnicity, and looking particularly at how we can mitigate the impact of that. So that is being done corporately by the council. And throughout this period, we have also continued to work with our partners, including health partners, to look at what we can do together to minimise the impact across our communities. The biggest issue in relation to health has been fear, I suppose, in the community about taking children for important health appointments because of fear of contracting COVID, although the children's health issues are other. So one of the things that we have done is we have ensured that we've rolled out some clear messaging to families through our schools to make sure that they're aware that it is safe and it's appropriate to take children to GPs or to hospital or to other settings for their health needs to be met, even during this time. And the feedback that we had was that information was well received and prompted an increase in attendances, which had dropped to worryingly low levels. But we, in children's services, we're expecting what we've described as the children's peak, which is that the impact of coronavirus will play out not in disease in our children now, but in all of the other knock-on impacts for our children in the coming months. And we are working with our safeguarding partners in health, in schools, and indeed in the police, to brace ourselves for a significant increase in the amount of contacts and referrals we get as a result.
If I can just quickly chip in on, firstly, on that free school meal system, what we are confident is that our systems work, so that when children become eligible for free school meals, that does happen very, very quickly, that the school's aware of that. And just to echo Rachel's recognition of the growth of the food poverty response in Merton, and to give thanks to all the partners, many partners involved in that, from Wimbledon Food Bank, Common Side, Fair Share, Don's Local Action Group, and many others.
Okay, so I think we'll wrap it up there, and I will hand over back to Peter. Thanks very much for your contributions, everybody, and thank you, Ellie, and to Rachel. Thank you very much. It's a great update, and thank you so much for your hard work and for keeping our children safe.
Thank you, it's a pleasure.
Thank you.
Natasha, thank you very much for stepping in there. I've moved to another room. That's about the limit of my technical ability to respond. My thanks too, indeed, to Eleanor and to Rachel for that. Our next item is the Climate Action Plan. For this one, we have Tobin Byers as the Cabinet member to introduce it. We'll also be hearing from Tom Walsh of Sustainable Merton, and Chris Lee is going to add some details on the financial side of it all. So can I invite Tobin first to introduce?
Thank you, Chair. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to say a few words this evening, and I'm very grateful that you've agreed to consider this item, which means that we are able to have some pre-decision scrutiny before Cabinet considers it in 2 weeks' time. I hope everyone's had an opportunity to review the plan. I think it's largely self-explanatory, so I don't intend to go into the detail of it. But as you say, Chris will provide some further information on the financial elements. And we've also got Katie Holter and Dominique Hill here, who will be able to take any more technical questions. It's also worth saying that the plan is still being finalised. One of the members of the Climate Emergency Working Group is currently providing some illustrations for it, but we do hope to have a final version of the plan for Cabinet's consideration in 2 weeks. There were only really 3 points I wanted to make in introduction, Chair, and the first was to say a number of thank yous. The plan has required a lot of input from an awful lot of officers across all departments, and I'm particularly grateful for them all for making the time in this period to feed into the actions, particularly in relation to the 2030 target. We've also had a lot of engagement from outside of the Council, both through the consultation that was undertaken last year, which we had a large response for, and also through the stakeholder workshop that we held at the end of February, which I know you yourself attended, which brought together a large number of partners from outside of the Council. I wanted to say a particular thank you to Katie and Dominique, our climate officers, who have put an enormous amount of work into the development of this plan. And I also want to say a particular thank you to all of the members of the Climate Emergency Working Group, which included Councillors Holden and Gould, and who have provided together a significant amount both of time and of expertise in developing this plan, and I'm really, really grateful to all of them. The second point I wanted to make is about the importance of collective action, because ultimately the Council cannot make this plan happen on its own. Colleagues will recall that in the Council motion that we passed last year, we set 2 targets, a net zero 2030 target for Council services and a net zero 2050 target for the wider borough, consistent with the Mayor and Government's targets. Whilst the 2030 target is largely within the Council's control, subject to financial considerations, the 2050 target is not. The Council controls only about 2% of the total emissions in the borough. Achieving net zero by 2050, therefore, will require collective action by us all, cross-party and cross-borough. The plan gives some indication of the scale of changes required, whether it's investing in insulation to make homes energy efficient, replacing central heating and gas cookers with low carbon alternatives, or changing the ways we travel around the borough. And whilst the Council has little direct control over these, there are things that we are able to put in place to facilitate people in making these changes, which is why the plan includes a number of enabling actions which the Council will undertake. It is important to recognise, though, that those enabling actions on their own will have no direct impact on the emissions that we see. That will only be achieved by individuals and businesses taking action. The other key point of this will be how we communicate and disseminate these messages to the community. And we've started looking at that in conjunction with the Climate Emergency Working Group and developing a communications plan for it. The third and final point I wanted to make is about COVID. Whilst the financial cost of the Council in responding to the pandemic is still emerging, and ultimately we remain hopeful that the government will reimburse local authorities for the cost of responding to it, the reality is that the pandemic has made achieving these targets even more challenging than they otherwise would have been. Well, Chris will say something on the costs specifically, but the figures alone are stark, 88 million for the 2030 target alone. We took the view that it was important to have a plan that set out everything that was required in order to meet the targets, even if we could not say entirely where all the funding would come from. And that brings me to an important aspect of the plan, which is that we intend it to act as a lobbying document as well as an action plan for ourselves in pushing the GLA and the government for the investment and legislative changes that we will need to see in order to meet these targets. The more important point I wanted to make about COVID, however, is that whilst the pandemic has represented the greatest public health crisis in any of our lifetimes and is likely to be with us for some time to come, it has done nothing to displace the urgent need to deal with the climate emergency. It's also shown how behaviour change, albeit forced on many of us through the lockdown, can have a really tangible impact on things like air quality, biodiversity and carbon emissions in a relatively short period of time where we do act. So I just wanted to end by reiterating my own personal commitment to this plan and to the targets within it, and to the administration's commitment to this plan. The pandemic has undoubtedly made it more difficult to achieve, but nonetheless important to pursue, and I hope we can continue working cross-party to that end. Thank you, Chair.
Tobin, thank you very much for that. Tom, we're going to hear from you next on behalf of Sustainable Mud.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, everyone, for inviting me to speak tonight. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Ah, lovely. You were looking, you were frowning there, Peter. I was wondering. I've learned not to follow Tobin now. He's taken all the comments that I was going to make and delivered them perfectly. So I think I want to add my thanks to his in terms of all the council staff, officers in general who've worked towards this, and obviously the members of the public who've been on the panel with me. Their dedication has been really, uplifting, to be perfectly honest. Unlike Tobin, my take on COVID is slightly different. I think one of the lessons we've learned is that you can steer a nation in a particular direction if the wherewithal is provided. So the leadership, the necessary finances, and the reason for doing so. And I think this is the problem that climate change is facing. Everyone saw COVID as an immediate threat. So everyone reacted, quite rightly, to quell that threat. People have forgotten temporarily that climate change is a vastly more dangerous threat with vastly greater numbers of lives at risk. So we need to take the positives from the COVID escapade and say, okay, a nation can work together and respond well if they're given the right leadership and the right wherewithal. The big issue we've come across, and we call it the elephant in the room, is that we come up with all these plans, these 146 changes that we need to implement. Some of them require vast amounts of money. On the face of it, it looks daunting. It looks as though it's impossible to find the money to do the things we all know need doing, until you actually look at the money that's floating around in our economies. It was said that last year, fossil fuels received $5 trillion of support, grants, supports, loans, and so on, and investments. That tells you a story that the money does exist. It's just being misdirected at the moment. And we don't have a lot of time left to us to redirect it. So lobbying has become a very, very, very important aspect of our lives from now on. The last comment worth making on the COVID is that so many people have recognized that they can actually see the stars again, breathe clean air, and also the number of species of wildlife that have increased their presence in our lives. So all of these things have become quite important to people who otherwise hadn't mentioned it as a priority. That I take a lot of encouragement from, particularly when you hear that the Chancellor is now saying that the recovery from COVID, the business and financial recovery, has to be green-led. And I think we need to be encouraged by that statement as well. Thank you, Chair.
Tom, thank you. And, yes, I echo your thoughts about the enjoying the benefits of clean air, hearing the birds sing, being able to see the stars in these last few weeks. Let me turn now to Chris Lee, if I may, as our Director of Environment. Chris.
Thanks, Chair. So I'll be brief and touch upon the funding issues, but also the links to other strategies and probably the main task for the council as community leaders in terms of our enabling and lobbying role. But we have a plan now, and it's a plan which shows us what we need to do. It's based on very detailed research by Ether, the consultants that we appointed in order to do this, and a clear benchmark. And whilst we know what needs to be done, we aren't yet clear exactly how that will be delivered and how it will be funded. And this task would have been enormously difficult before COVID kicked in and the impact on the council's finances. And it would probably have been easy to defer this until we had a clearer picture about the council's financial position. But that would have been dodging our responsibilities, really, because this will transcend COVID and this will last much longer and be a problem that we need to tackle for many years to come. And whilst we are clear about what needs to be done, the funding issue stands out very clearly. And the funding challenge for the council is set here at 88 million, which is probably broadly accurate, but precisely wrong, and that number will change. And there are a number of moving parts, Chair, in this challenge for the council and for the community, because technology is changing and our financial position will change. For the council, the big challenges around buildings, around schools and around transport. And whilst there are some budgets set aside for all of those areas, they're almost certainly not sufficient to deal with the problem. But we are in a very changing situation, not least in terms of the council's office stock, for example, in that the shift to remote working that we've just gone through will almost certainly have an impact on the office accommodation that we require. And that should reduce some of those costs. In addition, as I mentioned, technology is moving fast, and what we know is that prices will come down, which should assist us. But we will probably still need to take deep breaths in meeting this financial challenge and seek external capacity to bridge that £88 million gap. Talking to colleagues in CSF, the challenge for schools is that they receive, for the community schools, around £2 million a year to invest in the school stock. That in itself is just enough to continue to keep the fabric in a decent condition and not enough to deal with the investment that we're looking at here, which is principally about insulation and changing the heating and hot water source to one which is of renewable energy. The investment in many years in the past around gas-fired heating needs to be replaced, and that will be a significant cost. So that 2 million will not be sufficient. And Tom's point earlier around the government's move towards green recovery is one that maybe I'll touch upon in a moment. The cost to the borough, as we know, is even greater. And that, in large part, is very similar in that it's about transport, it's about buildings. And we've got 88,000 properties, which will require a different heating source over the next 30 years. That will require both behaviour change, because it's a technology that citizens are not used to, and it will require a significant investment. And that technology at the moment is more expensive than the prevailing heating systems that most people purchase and invest in. And that does require external government support in shifting the focus of jobs and skills in particular, and industry, in order to generate at scale the sort of infrastructure that we need to put into those homes, not just in Merton, but across London and across the country. And there is a fantastic opportunity now, given that some of our industry is starting to be at risk around aircraft and motor vehicle manufacture, to shift some of that skill and technology into the sort of scale that we need in order to build the heating systems for our homes and businesses and schools. And I'll move then to the fact that this policy, this strategy, needs to link to all other strategies that the council has. And I think we're in a fortunate position there, Chair, in that we have a local plan which is consistent with this strategy, and we have an air quality plan which is consistent with this strategy, and we have a transport plan which is consistent with this strategy. And all of those strategies have to be consistent with national policy. And part of our task will need to be, how do we influence London and national policy to be even more advanced, to be even more hard-edged in pushing for this shift towards zero carbon. And we'll want to be at the forefront of that. As Tobin touched upon, the silver lining of COVID is that we have seen a behaviour change in transport habits and in a shift towards working from home. But unfortunately, the reduction in CO2 that we've seen worldwide hasn't been anywhere near enough to convince us that this gap is sustainable. It's short term, it's time limited, but even at the level that CO2 has reduced in the last 3 months, even if that was sustained, it wouldn't be sufficient to tackle and meet the 1.5 degree target that we need to get to. And we know that as industry recovers and as people go back to work, this carbon reduction will be short-lived. We need to put in place sustainable behaviour change, sustainable infrastructure investment in order to, over the next 10 to 30 years, make that shift in terms of the way that we live our lives. And as the strategy makes clear, this isn't a hair shirt approach that we're looking at. This is a brighter and happier future where we can live our lives much more sustainably, much more locally. And I know that some cities are starting to grab hold of that opportunity now. We hear of Paris talking about the 5-minute city where you can live your life being able to walk or cycle within 5 minutes of your home. And we've had a taste of that over the last 3 months. The report then finally deals with how we measure success. And this is an area that will need to be developed over time. And the delivery plan that will follow this strategy, Chair, will go into much greater detail about how we will lobby, how we will put in place the enabling actions, and how we will ultimately deliver the outcomes. And we'll want to track the inputs and the outputs over time. But probably in the first few years, it will be more about the enabling actions and the inputs than it will be about measuring the outputs and the long-term successes. But nevertheless, we'll develop that measurement over time. I'll leave it there, Chair. Happy to answer questions, as I'm sure colleagues are.
Yes, thank you very much then, Chris. Can I invite questions? Owen.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you very much, Chris. I welcome this, as I'm sure everyone else does. But the one thing that struck me from your preamble, I suppose, was when you kindly listed off all the strategies that this is complementary to and coordinates with and integrates with. But the sort of glaring omission is the complete lack of an economic strategy that we have. Now, given the importance of economic recovery within Merton, given the vital role of Green New Deal initiatives that are going off across the country in various areas, when are we going to have the economic strategy that will harness the potential of Mitcham, promote that promote that recovery, and sort of encompass much of this?
Yes, if I could respond, Chair, I think you're absolutely right. I think our economic strategy is nascent and probably reflects the Council's financial position in that we haven't hitherto had a huge amount of money to pump prime the economic development ambition that we might want to have. And we'll want to develop that in parallel with the other key strategies that I mentioned. And I'll certainly take that back to look at how we can put more into that. I think a lot of our task will be about how do we seek to influence the Mayor, the LEP, and nationally in terms of the green infrastructure investment that we want and the shift of employment locally on our industrial estates, but also sub-regionally into the sorts of jobs and skills that we will want to see to develop the sort of investment that we'll need to have.
Thank you, Chris. Tom, you want to come in there? Some water.
Chair. Chris's comment about looking towards the future and looking towards a brighter future I think that's key to this whole discussion. We need to look at climate change in some ways as an opportunity rather than as a bane. And in answer to the previous question, an example of that would be that if we could create some kind of loan fund that people could borrow from to retrofit their homes, to insulate their homes, to reduce their carbon footprint, that would create a vast number of jobs across the country. There are 20 million odd houses that need this work doing. So the number of practitioners, the number of engineers and so on that would need to do this work is enormous and would probably counterbalance the loss of jobs from air and motor production.
Thank you, Tom. Further questions or comments? Natasha.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the report. My question is a bit more about community engagement, and I know that we've had the Climate Emergency Action Group, and obviously it's been extremely successful at coming together, making this plan and kind of inputting to it. But there's mention here of an implementation group to support the plan, and I'm wondering how we ensure that this encompasses as many voices from different areas of the borough, so not just people who are very keen on climate action, but people who, you know, live in the east of the borough who are more concerned about getting to work every day and making sure that they've got, you know, food in their stomachs and a roof over their head, but to get them engaged in the climate action that's needed, and to make sure that we have a wide spread of voices in these kind of groups that spring up.
Shall I take that, Chair, if you don't mind?
Please do.
Yeah. So I think that's a really good question, and that's ultimately what we are now grappling with as we move from the development of the plan to the implementation of the plan. In developing a climate emergency action plan, there isn't really a blueprint, and local authorities which have declared climate emergencies have all adopted slightly different practices, and some went for citizens' assemblies in developing the plan. And the benefit of that is that they provide a representative sample of people to the borough, which means that you get the voices who might not accept the need to tackle climate change as well as those who do. Our view at that point was that the benefits of the sort of group that we created, which was ultimately self-selecting in that we asked people to apply, was that we were able to harness an enormous amount of professional expertise through the working group. And I don't know if anyone's looked at the website which lists all the members of the group, but we do have a real array of talent and expertise, which has ultimately helped us to get the plan to the place it is in. So I believe that was absolutely the right way to go. But I do think that the next phase will need to include a more representative group of people. I think you're absolutely right that for some people in the borough, climate change will not be their #1 priority, and particularly activity that requires spending money to replace things like boilers or vehicles or cookers are not necessarily going to be at the top of their list. And that's only going to have been exacerbated as a result of the pandemic. So it is really important that the next phase we get a group which ultimately includes people like those who have been on the climate emergency group, who are both passionate and incredibly experienced, but also others who will be able to communicate with some of the other communities within the borough who won't necessarily see it as the same risk as they do. And I think that what we will ultimately end up with, and the report makes reference to an implementation group, and that's partly because we haven't finalised the detail of that yet. But it's something we're looking to discuss at our next climate emergency working group. And what we need to do is harness a group that brings together a lot of the established groups within the borough, because we've got very well established sustainable groups, Sustainable Merton, obviously a good example, but also Friends of the Earth, Merton Extinction Rebellion. And work is underway to bring those groups together to ultimately harness the power of all of them rather than them working separately. But I think our task on the council is to ensure that whatever group we end up with does include voices from other parts of the borough and does include voices for whom climate change is not their #1 priority. It was something that we were very keen to have on the climate emergency working group, and ultimately we had to go with the applications we had. And I think that in itself suggests that it won't be the easiest task to get that sort of representative group. But ultimately that's what we need to do, and we'll need to work with the voluntary sector because they will have links into certain communities in parts of the borough that we're potentially not as well connected into at the moment. So it's a very long way of saying, I think you're absolutely right that is the key task of the implementation group. And ultimately, we haven't quite got there yet, but now we move from development to implementation. That is the really key task.
Okay, thank you, Tobin. Let me come to Joan Henry and then Mansour after that. Joan.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Tobin. Very good. I noticed that I've been on the road for a very long time. I can remember years ago, Tom, that was one of your area, which you had talked about, and apparently I did end up having some work done in my house before. But what I want to find out from you, Tobin, have you, I can't see anywhere in your report where you talk to developers or even housing associations, because as you may realize, I mean, I'm on the planning committee, there are many houses, you know, they're developing now. And I mean, those are some of the target people we want to reach, the new houses that are going up. So what have you done? Have you talked to anyone about it? Have you speak to the housing associations, you know, regeneration, what have they been doing?
So I think you're absolutely right, and I'll maybe ask Katie to come in. I think you're asking two slightly separate questions there. So there's a question about what we need to put in place within our planning rules to ensure that we get good quality sustainable development, and that will be about looking at our own planning policies, and Katie will be able to touch on that. And the second point is about the engagement of particularly our housing associations, because local authorities which have been able to make quite quick progress with this are typically stock holding authorities. So Bristol, I know, has done an awful lot in retrofitting its existing stock. And unfortunately, we're not in that position, so we will be reliant on our housing associations. That being said, there has been some engagement, certainly with Clarion, which again, I'm sure Katie can clarify. And we did have attendance at the stakeholder workshop that I referred to earlier that took place in February from Clarion, and I believe one or two private developers as well, but Katie might be able to add to that, or Dominique.
Yes.
I'm going to pass it to Dominique because she's been leading on engagement with housing associations and development of policies for zero carbon buildings.
Dominique.
Yes. Hi. So as Tobin said, we had our climate action plan workshop in February, and we did have attendance from a couple of housing associations and developers as well. And it was really great to get their input, and there was definitely a lot of enthusiasm to kind of take the challenge on. And I think they will need to play an important part of the implementation group moving forward as well. On the local plan front, so we're currently in the process of reviewing our local plan policies in the context of the climate emergency, because quite a lot has happened since the stage 2 consultation draft was published. So we're looking at the local plan as a whole and how we can embed climate mitigation and adaptation across all policy areas, but we're taking a particular focus on the climate change policies, which look at new buildings and the standards that we set for those. And so we're looking at making those standards and targets much more ambitious, in line with new guidance that's come out over the last couple of years. So in 2019, there was the Committee on Climate Change's report on the UK housing being fit for the future. So we're looking to embed recommendations from that in our policies. And also earlier this year, the London Energy Transformation Initiative published a climate emergency design guide, which looked at the standards that new buildings would need to have in order to achieve our national, regional and local targets of being net zero carbon by 2050. So again, we're looking at how we can embed those in our local plan policies. And obviously that's subject to our viability testing, but we're keen to make those as ambitious as possible. So that will play an important part in making sure that new buildings are as sustainable as they can be, and that it minimises the retrofit burden for Merton, because any buildings that we build now which aren't net zero carbon will need to retrofit before 2050 in order to achieve our target. So we're really keen to get those policies as ambitious as possible. I hope that answers your question.
Dominic, thank you very much. Let me come now to Mansour Ahmed.
Thanks.
Your question.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks for the good report, which I really appreciate. I've got a question. What role the council has to play with regard to the development of a delivery plan?
Who wants to pick that?
Sorry. So in terms of the role we play, we are developing the delivery plan at the moment. I don't know if Katie wants to talk through what that will include a little bit.
Sorry, I didn't quite catch the question. Can you repeat it, please?
My question is what role the council has to play with regard to the development of a delivery plan?
Okay. Yes. So the strategy and action plan that's set out for Cabinet provides an overall framework from which we can start planning more detailed actions. Dominique and I have started to get a sense of what those actions are. We've been speaking to officers all across the council, and so we'll be developing much more detailed actions and milestones that link to all of the actions that are set out in the action plan, that where the council has a key role to play. So we'll be able to monitor those as they go along, dependent on the milestones, and also we'll be able to track progress through a regular update in the greenhouse gas inventory. We've got the technical report that was done by Ether that underpins this, forms the baseline, and our initial actions have formed a baseline, and we'll judge our progress against that.
Thank you.
Did that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
Oh, Councillor Keller, yeah.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Toby. No, apologies. This is very much linked to Natasha's question, and you might have answered it, but I had my own energy crisis and my battery's running out, so I had to run off in the middle of your answer. There's a danger with thinking this is all so self-evident, we'll bring people along without any problems. So the communication strategy is absolutely critical, because I don't think that's true. I think post-COVID, there will be times where this will be a hard sell at times, particularly if sacrifices are needed. Have you got a time frame on the communication strategy?
Sorry, I was checking if I was on mute or not. No, other than to say that the idea would be to establish fairly quickly now the successor to the community, to the emergency working group, because we see ultimately that the work of that group has naturally coming to an end when Cabinet considers this plan in 2 weeks' time. It does need to go to full council, but ultimately it shouldn't require any additional work between Cabinet and council. So we see that being a natural endpoint to the emergency working group, and then we need to develop the implementation group, and ultimately that is then linked to the communications plan, because it's about communicating the development. I think you're absolutely right, and I think I said that in my response to Natasha, that we do need to recognise that there will be a lot of people in the borough for whom this is not their priority. That would have been true pre-pandemic. It's probably even more true now. So the communications plan will need to reflect the fact that not everyone will view this as importantly as some of us do. that it won't be as easy a choice for some people as it is for others in terms of particularly financial investment for behaviour changes. And there might be any number of reasons why making these changes is more difficult for some than for others. So I think the communications plan both needs to recognise it's a far more nuanced message for some groups than others, and equally that we need to look at how best we engage with some communities in the borough, because we know that there will be certain groups for whom it will be easier to engage with through parties that aren't necessarily the council or anyone from an official capacity. So absolutely well aware of all of that, and that is part of our thinking. And clearly councillors themselves will have a key role in this, in communicating within their wards. So that will all be factored in as well.
Thank you, Tobin. Let me come to Nick McLean.
Thank you very much, Councillor Southgate. Just want to come back to the implementation group again. So I'm quite clear, this is going to be an advisory group. It's very much similar to what we've had now, just feeding information back to committees like this and to the council. I guess I'm just want to make sure that we're not getting into a situation with the tail wagging the dog. And also, I would like to, second question, and I'll finish this 2.6. You talk about a reduction in petrol and diesel road vehicles in favour of active and sustainable travel. Can you just confirm that sustainable travel includes e-vehicles and e-scooters and e-bikes, etc.? Thanks.
So I'll defer the second question to Katie, if I may. In terms of the implementation group, I don't think we see it so much as an advisory group, because ultimately the development of the implementation plan will set out exactly what is needed to meet the targets. And I think where we see this playing a really vital role is in particularly the 2050 target, where in order to meet that target, it will require behaviour change from the public rather than anything that the council can do. So it's more about how we use that group to communicate and work externally. There might be a lobbying role for that group, particularly when it comes to pushing for action to be taken by government, and that might not necessarily be funding, it might be legislative change. But we don't necessarily see that group as having oversight of the or scrutiny of the plan itself. We would see that sitting with sustainable communities scrutiny or indeed ONS. So it's probably more about helping us to meet the targets, particularly the 2050 target, in working with the community and looking at how we engage and communicate some of those changes that are required, rather than an advisory body that is feeding into the actions themselves. I don't know if Katie wants to add to that and perhaps pick up the other question in terms of sustainable travel.
So in terms of sustainable travel, about 20% of emissions are down to transport, and that's almost entirely road transport vehicles. And the input that cars have into that far outweigh all other modes of transport. So private petrol and diesel vehicles are a really key emitter at the moment. If we are to reduce emissions, the main focus needs to be on active travel, so things like walking and cycling. This has not only reduces emissions from down to essentially zero for anyone doing those sorts of journeys. It also has a number of other benefits, such as the improvement in air quality and the health benefits associated with active travel. So these really need to be the focus. And in order to make space for increased cycle lanes and wider paths and a greater focus on pedestrian areas, the amount of powered road vehicles has to necessarily drop. Having said that, we do recognise that cars, there are some circumstances where private vehicle use is essential. So we're not saying that there should be absolutely no cars on the road, and where those cars are necessary, those will need to be ultra low emission vehicles in order to be consistent with the 2050 target. So we have committed to actions around putting in place a charge point, an electric vehicle charge point strategy, so that we can enable electric vehicles to replace petrol and diesel.
Thank you, Katie. Chris, you want to comment on this? Yeah.
Good, Chair. Sorry, just to add to Katie's point, and to elaborate on that. Katie makes a very good point about public health, but just going back to the essential point around carbon reduction, whilst electric vehicles are certainly zero carbon at the point of driving, what we need to be mindful of is the whole life carbon pricing and the embedded carbon. If we changed all of our current petrol and diesel vehicles to electric vehicles, the carbon used in producing those vehicles would be equivalent. And the batteries in those vehicles are also made of an unsustainable supply of minerals and elements, which will be very difficult to provide on a sustainable basis. So if we believe that we can just move to electric vehicles and the problem will be solved, that isn't the case. That over the next 30 to 40 years, we will have to work towards a much greater awareness about embedded carbon and whole life carbon and carbon pricing ultimately, so that we know the true carbon footprint of everything that we buy, so that the impact on our lives and on the planet is taken into account at that point.
Thank you. Councillor Gretton, you wanted to come in. Ed?
Yeah, thank you very much, Councillor Southgate. I just wanted to refer to the strategy and action plan, because it focuses on active travel and cycling and urban greening and things like that. Those are two of the three principal aims, and I think we all appreciate how important funding is vastly important, and significant funds, of course, are going to be required as we move forward. I think we heard at the last overview and scrutiny commission there'd been a number of multi-million-pound funds for cycling infrastructure and this sort of thing, and greening, that for some reason the council administration had chosen not to apply for. And if you recall, it was only I think about 12 weeks ago or 3 months ago at the budget meeting, there was a proposal for green infrastructure living wall funds and cycling funds, which I think the council administration, I think with the Liberal Democrat group, chose not to support and effectively voted down. So what's done is done, but looking forward and looking toward the investment in measures which will help climate change in our borough, will the cabinet member, Councillor Byers, make a commitment to the residents of Merton that as and when funding opportunities are made available by central government or by TfL going forward, this council will make sure it prioritises those funding opportunities and applies for every single one of them?
I'm certainly happy to make the commitment that we will seek all funding opportunities that we are able to. That ultimately sits more with Councillor Welton, so some of the detail in Councillor Gretton's question I'm not able to comment on. But I wonder if Chris Lee just wants to say something about the funding that has been made available and what we're doing with that. But I am happy to make a commitment that we will, of course, seek all external funding where we are able to.
Thank you.
I think historically, Chair, I think historically the borough has been quite advanced in its thinking about accessing external funding. So we were one of the first boroughs to really maximise the feed-in tariff in relation to photovoltaic cells. And pretty much if a roof had the potential to carry PVs, we installed them. And that's paid huge dividends. And you can see in the report that we've been able to reduce our reliance on bought electricity and shifted to renewable energy more significantly than pretty much any other neighbouring borough. We will need to access external resources, and we are currently in the process of significantly changing the way that we fund our transport investment. We've lost this year around £1.5 million that would ordinarily be available through LIP funding to fund a lot of the shift towards a more sustainable future and active travel. And we've made significant bids running to over £1.5 million so far through TfL and to the DFT to access the resources that we need to continue with that programme. And we'll continue to look at how we can do that. Another area of significant investment that's been made available through our access to external funding has been through investment in electric vehicle charging points, and through the Go Ultra Low Carbon City scheme, we've been able to access money, and that's seen on the roads and streets of the borough in the proportion of EV charging points that we have compared to the London average, and the national average is significantly higher. But I take the point, we need to continue to drive that agenda and access as much external funding as we can that's consistent with our ambition.
Chris, thank you. John Dehaney. John, we're not hearing you. Can you unmute?
Let me see if I can do
Okay,
anything about
hear you now.
it. You can hear me now?
I can hear you now. Yes.
Right. Yeah, can I just ask Chris if the government and the mayor, are they aware of the costs, the 88 million costs to us for climate change? And have they given you any ideas or any support on how you can, fund the cost? Or it's just left to the borough to do it on their own? Have you heard me?
I think I got most of that. I think the question, it was breaking up on my end, but I think the question, if I understand it correctly, is how will we fund the £88 million bill?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
So we do have, over the medium-term financial strategy, some money set aside for fleet transport changes. That sits within my department by and large, and a lot of our vehicles are petrol or diesel vehicles. And some of those vehicles are owned by our contractors operating in the borough. And some of the carbon is related to schools. And as I mentioned in my introduction, we get £2 million a year from the Department for Education to support that. And the other investment needed is in our buildings. And we do have some budget set aside in the medium-term financial strategy to invest in low carbon technology in our buildings, where we need to change lighting, where we need to change heating system. But it won't be enough. And the council's financial position, as members know, is slightly turbulent at present. And it's almost certain that we will need to access external resources and look at how we reduce our carbon footprint by occupying fewer buildings, using fewer vehicles, and being imaginative in the way that we seek to access resources for our schools. So I haven't got the answer, but we will be lobbying and looking to see how we can achieve meeting that financial target over the next few years.
Right, thank you, Chris.
Natasha.
Thank you, Chair. So just back to the point about lobbying for resources and stuff. So, just taking the example of schools and the kind of the money it will take to retrofit and kind of make them carbon neutral. What kind of lobbying will you be doing, and kind of what plan is there to ramp up that type of campaigning to get that funding that we need?
So that's happening at already starting to develop at the London Council's level, and through an organisation I'm involved in, the London Environment Directors Network. We have a climate change group, and with London councils allied with the mayor, we're looking to develop a green recovery approach across London boroughs. All London boroughs, pretty much by and large, have got a similar plan to ours. We're all tackling the same problems, and it's fortunate that the Chancellor of the Exchequer is talking about a green recovery, and hopefully we'll be pushing at an open door. but we will be backed up by the Committee for Climate Change, looking to lobby in order to ensure that that investment and that legislative and policy change is backed up, and we see that coming through. In terms of schools, one of the things we've seen in some other local authorities is the development of grassroots community-based energy projects to help support schools make that transition. Historically, those have been focused on crowdfunding money to invest in pump priming the photovoltaic installation required to put onto the roofs. We're fortunate that we're slightly ahead of the curve there and we don't need the PVs, but the model can be expanded to look at other areas of investment for schools or other public sector facilities in accessing the public's investment opportunities. These are with interest and paid back on the basis of, in the case of photovoltaics, paid back on the basis of the energy bought through an energy company. So we can look at those models and see where those might be appropriate for some of the challenges that we'll face over the coming years.
Thank you, Chris. Let me come to Councillor McCain. Nick, please.
Thank you. I just want to go back to Chris's point. The Chancellor has been brought up a couple of times, and yes, you know, it will be a green recovery. But when the Chancellor talks about it, he talks about green technology, high tech. He doesn't talk, he's not going to be talking about some old school tax and ban takeaway choice, which seems to be on several of the agendas at this meeting. I'm disappointed that the e-cars are not going to be taken into account. I don't know what you base your figures on, Chris, but if we're going to talk about the Conservative Chancellor, we can guarantee that we'll be focusing on high-tech technology to solve climate change so that we don't get in a position where we're taking ourselves back to having to ride a horse.
Okay. Tom, you wanted to come in there? Joys of horse riding? Tom, you need to unmute.
Can't hear him.
Tom, we can't hear you.
Yep. You're back on mute, Tom.
Tom, we're not hearing you at all. I need to.
I'll just unmute you. If you leave it, I'll unmute you. You should be okay now.
Can you hear me?
We can now. We can now.
Thanks. Sorry about that, guys. Me and technology, not great friends. There are 4 areas of funding that we need to look at. I did mention the first earlier about fossil fuels. Not only are these the fuels that are causing half the problems, they're the fuels that so far have drawn vast sums of money to them. The good news here is that that is now changing, and investors all over the world are now realizing that fossil fuels have had their day. So they are going to be looking for somewhere else to invest their millions. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, as Chris has pointed out, every time you generate your own electricity, you're avoiding the need to buy some from somewhere else. So the country's energy bill generally for a year is over £100 billion. That's money that very often we spend buying foreign gas, foreign fuel, and so on. If we can recirculate that money within our own economy, again, that's another source of funding. And finally, carbon taxes are going to have to come in at some point in our lives. And that will, again, give us a source of green income, if you like, for moving forward.
Tom, thank you. I'm going to come to conclude on this now. And I want to say something myself. I think this is actually the most important policy initiative that's come to this council, certainly in the 18 years in which I've been a councillor. I think we need to do rather more than simply thank those who presented it, note and move on. If we're going to engage in proper pre-decision scrutiny, then it should be for us to point to where ways in which we can help Cabinet, help Council to make the most of this policy, which is going to be with us for many, many years to come. I circulated a note suggesting 4 particular points on which we could base a referral back. Let me just summarize them quickly. That the Climate Change and Action Plan be embedded in all of our policies, just as the way equalities is embedded now. So we look at every new policy with regard to where climate change might be a relevant consideration. Second point, that I would like the Sustainable Communities panel to be monitoring the delivery of this plan, and indeed its more focused successor plans for the long haul, for the 30 years it's going to take to 2050 for us to deliver on this. Thirdly, and Dominique's referenced this, the delay in the adoption of the local plan, which has been really because of the delays in adopting the London plan, that does give us scope and an opportunity to review our own local plan for the opportunities perhaps to reflect the ambitions of the action plan. I think particularly in terms of domestic heating. I sit on planning committee, we get very little information about the proposed heating energy systems going into new build. If we have the courage to be far more prescriptive about that, I think we could make the kind of changes that the Merton rule achieved all those years ago on introducing the use of sustainable energy in industrial buildings. And the fourth point, and I'm sure Tom will be able to endorse this, we're talking about legislative change on the one hand, but on the other hand, there is a whole series of individual actions which, if taken together, can bring about massive change. And you will recognise that with the proposals about active travel, more walking and cycling, changes in diet, if people get on board with being far more willing to shun the use of single-use plastics and so on. These are small things in themselves, but if you look at the work that Sustainable Merton is doing there with its community champions, added together, that they could achieve a lot. So I'm going to invite you, I would comment by all means, but the 4 points I set out, if those can form the basis for us to make a referral to Cabinet when this goes before them in 2 weeks' time.
Thank you, Chair.
Owen, you want to come in on that?
Yeah, just with one of your points, Chair. It was about the licensing. Sorry, not licensing, planning even. I didn't really understand what you were saying, whether or not you were saying we should lobby for further powers, mindful that the powers that we do have are under a bit of a sustained assault from central government anyway at the moment. So I just was hoping you could expand on that further, and if we're going to make a recommendation to Cabinet, that it's achievable and within our gift.
Yes, certainly. I think that, I mean, Chris may be able to help us on this one, but I'm just suggesting that we do view our policies. Dominic has mentioned we are already doing this. Okay, art of the possible, but I think it's worth pushing the envelope and seeing if we can't be rather more prescriptive than we have been to date, particularly on smaller developments on the.
I'm broadly in agreement with you, Peter. Is there's a general tendency when it comes to planning and licensing that people apportion responsibility and therefore blame, authority, responsibility and accountability with bodies that aren't necessarily empowered, like the council, to do these things. And what I'm always worried about when we make recommendations and we make comments, that we do so in a way that we do stuff that we know the council can actually do, and we're not saying, yeah, can the council go away and please work out how to, you know, make the sky bluer and the grass greener, please. You know what I mean? That actually we're very specific about what we can do.
Yes, if I can, I'll just ask Chris perhaps to help here about. It's really about the art of the possible, I think. Can we look again at the local plan as it emerges, Chris, to see that we are doing all we possibly could on?
Yeah, in simple terms, yes, absolutely. And I can reassure members that that's what we are doing. And I know that with Tara Butler's leadership, we will look to see how our policies in the local plan can be as advanced as possible. We're limited by two things. One, we have to be in conformity with the London Plan and National Planning Policy Framework. And secondly, viability. So we cannot put policies in which would be economically unviable for a developer to produce development, and it would fail at a public inquiry if we were to do so. So within those boundaries, we will certainly seek to push as hard and as fast as we can in order to get the policies that support this zero carbon approach.
Okay, Owen.
Yeah, very specific, and it's on the same issue, and I'm not against. Just to be clear, I'm not against either one of you saying. I'm just aware that other boroughs have done things like, and I'm not talking now about the Little Amsterdam stuff, but other boroughs have looked at car-free developments, low-car developments, accesses like that within plans, right? And I'm most certainly not. I'm aware we don't have the 35 million that, you know, the Little Amsterdam or whatever was, but looking at, and in my ward, obviously one of the main things I'm concerned about, whether it's 650 or it's 850 units built on sewers, is the amount of traffic that's going to have in Church Lane, the links there. Obviously there's a tram spot there, it's got, I'm thinking, well, isn't this the sort of place, isn't this the sort of unit where actually we can be pioneering and actually only allow traffic for disabled people who have, and we have disabled specialists housing on the ground floor, you know, and then other people are only allowed to bring it in to move or whatever, you know, no parking space. These are the things that we need to be looking at for the next 50 years. So I just want really to if it's okay, Peter, to change your broad aspiration into something specific, that we look at low car and no car developments within the borough, because I also think that would tie in to Councillor McLean's point, which is, much as I know he hates taxes on demerit goods, but is not against subsidies on merit goods, I think would be the fair, and, you know, shining a path on good behaviour rather than using a stick against bad behaviours. And I think this is the shining a light on good behaviours and looking at that element of stuff rather than prohibitory taxes and that way creating good behaviours. So I hope it's something that we could all get behind.
Yes, I think so. If I think about what was in my mind when I drafted that, it was very much about the low carb, no carb initiatives to make sure we were pursuing those. So if Julia's content to pick that up. Yes, good. So if we're otherwise happy there, we can
One thing, Chair, I was just going to, I thought it was useful to know, I was very pleased to see in the report that there is a reference to 2009, when I think a certain Councillor David Williams was leader of the council, and that was when our borough saw the first climate strategy for Merton published, and since then, of course, we've seen the council's emissions over the years that followed that strategy report reduced by 40%. So I think that was it's definitely useful to have a report and note that, and a big thank you to Councillor Williams for having published that strategy in 2009 when he was leader of the council.
No politics, please.
Yeah, thank you for that. Anyway, can we move on now, do you think?
Yes.
So we're happy to adopt that. John, you have a particular point there, or can we move on? Okay, let's subject to that particular point about low carb, no carb that Owen has raised, we'll take that as adopted. And if I can thank then...
Please, just to be clear, sorry, Peter, carb. I'm not talking about carbon, I'm not talking about carbohydrates. I'm talking about development of low carb and no carb developments.
Ah, that's a bit of a different thing, isn't it?
A very specific thing that we can look at, not a up in the sky thing. And I'm not saying for a moment, just before I could see Councillor Gretton and Councillor McLean getting itchy, that we suddenly turn existing places into car-free zones and start finding people for all that jazz. I'm not saying that. I'm talking about the new places like Suez, where we know that we're going to have densification problems, air quality problems, congestion problems, no car and low car.
If I could just add that, Councillor Pritchard, I agree.
Okay, we seem to... I mean,
20 is an odd year, isn't it?
Sitting on the... I think I'm not sure much whether there's scope to do a lot more on low car, no car, because we pretty much insist on new developments being permit free when they're within CPZs. But yes, we can, yeah, sure, let's build that in. Paul. Councillor Keller. Paul, come on.
In defence of Peter's point, he's simply saying let's audit what we're doing, make sure there aren't opportunities we're missing. And Chris has said that's happening anyway, so we're just encouraging that process. He's not offering anything more than that. I think that's a use.
No, I don't have a problem with Peter's point, wider point about, yeah, let's just make sure this is all get integrated. But all I'm trying to say is let's actually ask for a specific as part of it, rather than saying, yeah, we checked the 7 existing strategies and we made sure that we reference this document of all of them, and we have it as a checklist, so every policy recommendation that goes to Cabinet Office has climate impact on it. 100%. Really, really happy with that stuff. But I'm just saying one more specific thing.
Okay, we're happy there, I think. Can I move on to our final item? And that is the sorry, I'm very rude of me. I've failed to thank Tobin, Chris, Dominique, and Katie, and indeed Tom for the
You're very welcome.
For their time.
Very welcome.
A useful session. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all. Go have a cold drink.
Can I just add, I do quite like the drawings in the report. We've had a lot of nice school drawings, haven't we, in support of the NHS, and I rather like that that style. So,
can I say, Chair, that you've got Katie to thank for those?
Okay, thank you, Katie. Our last item is the work programme. This is on page 47. And really plans as we come out of the most critical phase of the pandemic to restart the work of the individual panels. Discussions have taken place between officers and representatives on each of those panels, so with this cross-party, to begin to draft a programme for the year ahead. For our own, we are looking at the Public Spaces Protection Order next time, the Scrutiny Improvement Plan. That's probably enough within the scope of this format. Do I have any comments on this? Natasha.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just wondering, the stuff about the equalities and community cohesion strategy, I'm wondering if we need to move it up a bit, if that's possible, because given the kind of the fallout from COVID and the kind of Black Lives Matter movement and the kind of pressures that's going to have on our community, and the kind of fights, that internal kind of fights that can start, I think it might be an interesting thing for us to kind of have a view of at this stage.
I think you're right. I mean, Julia and I did discuss this, and the way that Black Lives Matter exploded, I think up until then we felt we'd got this pretty well sorted, and we suddenly realised that, you know, probably have a clue. Actually, Julia, is there scope to bring that up the?
Yes.
Yeah.
What would have happened if we hadn't gone into lockdown is that we would have received it at the April meeting. So we've missed a year, and we've put it into April 2021. But if members are interested in it, either what's been achieved over the past year could be circulated by email, or we could have, I mean, I think there would be space to slot something into the July meeting on this, but it will be very much around what was in the action plan that you can't change, obviously, because that it's already been agreed. So you'll be looking at what's been achieved against the action plan targets over the past year. And I think what you're asking for is something slightly different.
Okay.
And that maybe officers wouldn't be ready. Ready with that information yet, because as Chris Lee was saying, there's a sort of a corporate working group looking at those sorts of impacts.
But maybe I mean, I didn't mean like move up to like July, but I mean just into this year. Would there be a way of doing that, or is that completely out of the question?
I can ask the officer who leads on it, but because it's done on an annual cycle, it might not be possible to break into that cycle, and you might end up with very out of date information that you would have had this April. If you see what I mean. But let me see what can be made available, and then I can let you all know offline.
Paul, Paul, do you want to comment on this?
What we should have received in April, can the information be circulated? It will be.
I can do. I can ask for it and circulate it. Yeah.
Can I suggest then, if we were to look at that and really ask ourselves how relevant is this to Black Lives Matters, and have we really got it? Because my real worry is, and perhaps it's just me, that we haven't. But let's read that critically and see whether we need something else, perhaps, you know, later this year to address that.
Okay.
If we're otherwise happy with the proposals on the work programme, it would seem so. Good. Well, it's a warm evening. Thank you all. Thank you particularly to Julia and Rosie for supporting the meeting, and to all of you for your attendance. Look forward to seeing you virtually in rather less than a month's time. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you.